Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are here to have a restoration retrospective on the Avalon and Fortescue beneficial use projects that were undertaken here in New Jersey. My name is Adriana Zito Livingston. I work for the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey, and it's been my pleasure to work alongside this monitoring team, monitoring vegetation, which was a core responsibility of the Nature Conservancy. I'm also my privilege to lead the Beneficial Use Learning Network, along with a number of colleagues from a variety of organizations. So as to not embarrass myself, but to call out my co-collaborators on the organizing committee for the Learning Network. Can you guys go ahead and raise your hand, either in person or using the Zoom reactions? That would be great. So this is an effort being undertaken by a number of organizations, primarily led by the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But we're excited to be pulling folks together who've done beneficial use projects and participating actively and intentionally in transferring knowledge between projects so that we can advance the practice of beneficial use. So today during the webinar, we are going to take a moderated discussion approach, but also have a presentation in the middle portion of the day, portion of our time together. So without further ado, I would like to invite our panelists. So we are joined by several panelists from the project teams for the Fortescue and Avalon projects. So panelists, as you introduce yourself, I would ask you to share with us the organization you work for and your role on either Avalon or Fortescue projects, or both. So I'll call on you in order to avoid confusion. So Scott Douglas, can you kick us off?
Unmute here. Okay, so my name is Scott Douglas. I'm the Dredging Program Manager for the NJDOT Office of Maritime Resources, and I was the project manager for the Fortescue project in collaboration with Dave Golden from Division of Fish and Wildlife.
Thank you, Scott. Brian.
Yes, I'm Brian Kramer with GreenVest. I was a project manager for GreenVest portion of the work on both Fortescue and Avalon. We were mainly involved with design and permitting, and on the implementation side, we did do some of the monitoring elements as well.
Great, thank you. Mary, I believe you're next.
Hi, I'm Mary Pace Goldman. I worked with Princeton Hydro at the time for these projects. I did the engineering design for Fortescue and Avalon, working closely with GreenVest, as well as with Scott Douglas and the Army Corps of Engineers.
Joel, you're next, sorry.
Hi, I'm Joel Piccoli. I'm a research scientist with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And I was involved from the department side of it with the design of the project, later on with some of the monitoring, and I wrote the state permits for the projects.
Thank you, Joel. Mattia.
I'm Mattia Jepsen. I'm also a research scientist with the New Jersey DEP. I've worked on this project first as a project manager for the Nature Conservancy, and now for the New Jersey DEP. My main roles were as a core team member in selecting sites, designing sites, but also in coordinating and doing some of the monitoring.
Thank you. Lenore.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lenore Tedesco. I'm the Executive Director at the Wetlands Institute. I served on this project as part of the science team, and then came in with some of the adaptive management and did some of the monitoring on site. Other staff members of the Wetlands Institute worked on some of the monitoring of the Ring Island project site, which we're not really talking about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenore. And last but not least, Rob.
Thanks, Adriana. Yes, I'm a soil scientist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I am currently an acting soil survey regional director for the Southeast United States, also a senior regional soil scientist for the Southeast region, and got involved with this project as the soil survey office leader for the Hamilton, New Jersey soil survey office. And we were brought in to begin to understand and help the project managers that just introduce themselves on the exact soil conditions that are on the site, especially with regards to soil pH and for vegetation establishment on the site. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate all of our panelists being here today. So the format, just briefly, we'll ask folks can be on or aside from the panelists, you can be on video or off as you so desire. We will be leading off with a moderated discussion that's going to be led by Bart Wilson, who I'll ask to introduce himself in a moment. And then you as participants will also have the opportunity to ask questions. So you can feel free at any point in the chat to either put an R in the chat if you'd like to be called on for a question when we reach that section, or you can type your question directly in the chat. There'll also be an opportunity for you to raise your hand and be called on when we get to that portion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bart Wilson from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He can tell you more about himself, and he'll be our moderator for this discussion of constructability.
Thank you so much. So yes, Bart Wilson. I am a geologist with the Northeast region, Region 1, Legacy Region 5. I work out of Delaware, but I've been working on beneficial use and elevation enhancement projects from Rhode Island to Virginia. And I'm glad that everyone could join us today. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion, being able to kind of look at past projects in a more iterative sense rather than just hearing a presentation can be very helpful, especially for, you know, when we get to that point of this discussion today, if you have your questions and have a real opportunity to kind of join in the conversation. So I already noticed we're ahead of schedule, so that's a good thing. That's the way to start. So I'll take it from here. So one of the things I really wanted to kind of start, and I want to thank my panel ahead of time for, you know, taking part in this. I know it's not always easy. So hopefully I don't ask too tough of questions. So I think the biggest thing, so, you know, this first part today, we're going to talk about constructability, which is a pretty wide term, but it's also a piece of beneficial reuse that we don't necessarily get into that much, where, you know, why we choose some of the areas, but also, you know, how did it actually go with construction? How did it actually work with dredging contractors, placing the sediment, containment, different things like that. And, you know, so I think we felt it was very valuable to kind of really focus a little bit on that. And then we'll kind of transition over into Mattia, who's going to give us some more detailed observations from very site-specific things, outcomes. So one of the things I wanted to ask first, and I'll start with the Foresight group, you know, we pay a lot of attention to, you know, these days, you know, we have sediment source available, and we need to look for restoration sites. So I would like the Fortescue team first to talk about, you know, what did they use to vet the project location at Fortescue? You know, what allowed you to really focus in on that marsh for the restoration? And with that, you know, when you were doing that, did you consider, you know, SAV, different things like, well, maybe not SAV, but shellfish beds, anything like that into your focusing on that site? We can start with Brian or Scott, if you want to start with that.
I think you should speak, Brian should probably talk through the selection of the marsh before we talk about the channels. I think the marsh is probably the dog part of this, rather than the channel being the tail in some ways for most of the folks on this call.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And Mattia, if other panelists feel free to jump in. You know, I think this site, prior to having a source to the sediment, this site had been looked at for quite some time, you know, using LiDAR data, other data to really hone in on some of the marshes in this area that seemed like they were lower in elevation. And then, you know, then obviously the sediment component came. We were looking at that. We knew there was a dredging need, and we began to look at marshes in the immediate vicinity, and then beyond that. I mean, there's always limitations, as Scott will probably get into, on how far you know, dredge can be pumped hydraulically, et cetera. There's other options, obviously putting on a barge and and moving it a lot further distance. But, that came into, some of the site selection process. But, it was based on some data, and Mattia, maybe you can get into some of the data that we had when we went in there. And then we looked at a much larger marsh footprint, and then we really honed in on the areas that were in most need of restoration.
Yeah, the general process for each one of the sites was to look at the general area, look for state-owned land within the navigation channels that needed to be dredged. So we looked at many different places around the state. We found the state-owned marshes, and then we did a desktop analysis on those, looking at relative elevation with the LiDAR data, looking at historic aerial photographs over time to see how the sites were changing. We used some of the other mapping mapping layers that were out at the time. There are now many more layers to choose from. And then based off of that, we selected a handful of sites to go out and look at. And we went out as a whole team. The dredging project managers came out to kind of talk through constructability. And the ecologists went out. We went out with Princeton Hydro and Greenvest and the Nature Conservancy and New Jersey DEP. And we walked the marshes. And at Fortescue, there were these signs of loss of elevation where you would have Spartina patens on a little loose clump, and then you'd have tall form Spartina alterniflora shooting up from really wet spots kind of around it. And the marsh was hummocky and very difficult to walk on. So we had initially identified one small area that was like that. But then there was more sediment that could be used. And so then we did another analysis looking for other areas, and we found a spot at the back of the area where we ended up placing that was particularly low in elevation. And so those were the two areas that we ended up using. And then we did more of the full-on topographic surveys and water level logger surveys. So it was definitely kind of an iterative process where we started with many options and then continued to narrow it down until we found sites that we thought were suitable.
No, that's great. And I think along those lines, that brings up the idea of two things. What do you think were the best data sets for, again, you talked about the desktop analysis, but once you got out there, what were the primary means you used to kind of help differentiate between, the marsh that was in the greatest need or the most level of deterioration? What were some of the ones that really you felt really highlighted that stuff well, especially when you talked about identifying the site, but also talking to your regulatory partners on communicating that to them? And that's not only to you, Mattia, but anyone who.
Brian or Mary, do either of you want to, or Joel, do you want to jump in and say anything? I think in terms of our regulatory partners, the Greenvest put together a series of, so thinking about Avalon, which is a different site that had kind of different characteristics, but Greenvest put together a time series of photographs looking at the change in pools over time. And you could really, it made it very clear that pools were expanding and also that the marsh was eroding from the edge. And so you could see these areas where we used to have marsh platform, but the pools were expanding and they met an eroding shoreline edge. And then there had been kind of a large blowout of marsh. So I think that was pretty illustrative, as was the condition of the marsh platform and its instability at Fortescue. I think those are probably some of the, at Avalon, the undercutting of the marsh pools, they were being undercut to the point where you could see underneath the sides of the marsh pretty far. So you could kind of bounce, you're just kind of floating on these parts of marsh. Does anyone have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, this is Mary. I can just weigh in. I know at Avalon in particular, there was also quite an extensive review. You referenced those aerial photographs that Greenvest had pulled together of sort of general percentage of pans and pools as it related to overall marsh plain, and then looking at reference sites at other locations to kind of compare to see sort of what the levels of degradation were between those two sites. And then, you mentioned the undercut banks. There was also some discussion and review in the field about, how much marsh edge had been lost, and then, where there were sort of areas of significant collapse that had been noted during the site selection period at the Avalon property. And with Fortescue, I think it was a little bit different there just because of a difference in the type of material at the site, and also just the sort of level of erosion that was experienced there. But there was, to your point, a smaller pocket originally identified, and then a need to look for additional areas there that may have been in need of some restoration and improvements as well.
That's great. Thank you. And so this discussion brings up another point, and this is going to be for Scott and Lenore. The idea about pumping distance. And this is a huge component when we start thinking about these desktop analysis and trying to figure out sites. So if you guys don't mind talking a little bit about, pumping distance and how that worked into the conversation, and maybe some aspects of how, what that discussion looked like, and some of the trade-offs that you guys discussed from developing both project areas.
Well, I can speak to the Fortescue project. And about dredging in general. Most of the dredging on the Jersey Shore is done with hydraulic pipeline dredges. And because of the shallow waterways back there, can't bring a large dredge back. So there is a limitation to how far you could practically pump. And obviously the farther you pump, the more it costs. So there is an upper limit. I usually think of 5 miles as being the outside edge of what can be done with one of these small dredges. And that does require multiple booster pumps. If you can get the project to within a mile, which we were with Fortescue, then it's very easy to do without a booster pump, which gives you a little bit more control, a little bit more reliability. The more pieces of equipment you put in the system, the more opportunities for breakdowns and delays.
Yeah, this is Lenore for Avalon. I could speak for briefly for Monica. That's the Army Corps project there, and her contracts typically use no more than 10,000 foot, so under that 2 mile range. And I know she prefers the 1 mile range for exactly the reasons that Scott's mentioning. But her contracts would go to little under 2 miles if needed.
Great. Now, another key piece with dredging projects is, trying to match up need versus the area. But one of the things that comes up more and more is that as you're dredging these channels, there's something that I know Lenore and Scott know very well, variations in quantity, where as you dredge it, a significant amount of time may have passed between you've done your surveys and when you're dredging. So I wanted to ask the design teams for both of these projects, was variation in quantity considered in the design? And, if there are any, in hindsight, lessons learned that maybe you should have integrated, or things that popped out to you that were kind of important for people to think about moving forward with that?
Yeah, on the design side, we definitely knew there was going to be some variation. So at Avalon in particular, we had ranked the various design areas based on order of priority, based on what was needed to be restored of highest priority down to a lower priority, because we knew that we may have a variation in material available. And we also just weren't 100% sure, what the liquid content versus the sediment content was going to be in the dredge material placed at that site. So we broke that down into a series of different cells. We prioritized placement in the ones that were ranked as highest need first. And also that was somewhat driven during construction based on where the dredge was set up, so that we knew how far we could reach with the equipment to place material in those individual cells. So there was some changes when that actually got under construction from what we had anticipated during design. But for the most part, it pretty well followed the order of priority of what we expected. I think ultimately, we did not place material in all of the cells planned at Avalon. We ended up not having as much material as we thought we may. So that ended up working out really, really well. At Fortescue, similar discussions happened there with Scott's team. And I'm sure Scott will weigh in on this. I know we had lengthy discussions about sort of how the material was going to be placed. We had a sort of a detailed pipe network that was laid out across that site for how material was going to be spread. Given the sandy nature of that material, it did not disperse as far as we had anticipated. So there was some adaptive management that needed to occur there as well. But I believe in that situation at Fortescue, we ended up, utilizing all of the areas anticipated for placement. Some were slightly lower than anticipated, but again, we did have that sort of factor of safety built in, knowing that we could have material, quantity variations as we built.
If I can just say, there's variations in quantity and quality. So the nature of the material as well as how much is there. In Fortescue, it's a much more dynamic environment than at Avalon in terms of the currents in the channel and wave action. And we were doing the project in the winter. So we had done a lot of our initial evaluation of the material in the summertime when waters are calmer, and we thought we had more silt than we ended up having. It didn't take many storms to blow the silt out of the channel, and then it wasn't available for us when we were doing construction. So there is always that, and adaptive management is the key, monitoring your site. But I think in terms of quantity, to really get at what Bart's driving at, is that there's two ways of looking at this. From the dredger's perspective, you want to make sure that when you bring your contractor in, that you're going to be able to complete the work. So a lot of these projects, in order to leverage funding, we're doing a navigational dredging project. So there is a motive on the dredging side. It's not just to provide material to the beneficial use project. So that needs to be thought through. There's also, of course, from the marsh perspective, you want to have enough to meet your goals in as many areas, if not all areas, as possible. So that needs to be balanced, and there needs to be a management of expectation about what you're going to get. What I like to see is when you have multiple areas, as we did in Avalon, that are prioritized, or multiple areas that are available for different types of material as they become available during the project, or as things change during the project, as was the case at Fortescue. So we sort of had the best of both worlds. And if you could combine them so that really what you have are multiple areas on the site that can be used to utilize all available material that you get, but then a backup place to put materials so that if there is any extra at the end, that you don't have to try to force that into the marsh, but also so that the dredging project, should adaptive management strategies require a delay in placement, that you don't have to stop the dredge. From my perspective, that's a multiple five-figure daily bleed out of the project. It could jeopardize the success of the project if you had to stand down for very long. So you need backup placement locations for both sides.
That's great discussion. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would just add on to what Scott just mentioned. I know in particular for placement of the material at both of the sites, we had some issues where we had to stop either for weather or because of issues, in particular at Avalon, with the amount of water content in the material where it was starting to breach containment. So, being aware of that and understanding the financial implications, not only schedule implications for the navigation channel dredging, is really important on the, ecological restoration design side as well.
Yeah, those are great points. Very great points. And that brings up another kind of transition in that, you figure out what area you want to work in. You come up with a design based upon surveys, different aspects of need, type of material you have. I would love kind of each project team to talk about the idea of constructability, and that, once you went from design to construction, what were some of the issues that arose, and then how did you deal with them, especially from the perspective of these were some of the first projects doing beneficial use in the state of New Jersey? You know, kind of how did you go into it versus how it was actually constructed? What were some of those differences, and how did you kind of overcome some of those issues associated with placing it on the marsh, containment, different things like that? We can start with Fortescue.
Yeah, I would say we had some really good lessons. We certainly went into it with a lot of technical ideas and a lot of possible. I would say it was over-engineered. We really dove in and looked at what we consider to be a Cadillac approach. At this, in hindsight, a Cadillac approach. We thought it was necessary. All of the array of pipe distribution was very complicated. The amount of containment was significant, thousands of feet of containment. And as it turns out, it was probably not a factor in our success, but more caused undue anxiety on the part of the biologists when they saw all that equipment dragged out over the marsh for an extended period of time in order to try to establish this array, which, as it turns out, we ended up not constructing all of it anyway. We constructed an array to the deepest and largest areas first, and it turns out that we didn't need to assemble the entire array. And that, in fact, we found out that the marsh platform, as the equipment went over it, was becoming more and more unstable. So it was less likely that we were going to be able to it was unlikely we were going to be able to complete construction of that full array anyway. So, you know, I think we've learned to spend more time thinking about the hydrology of the marsh and how the material is going to behave as a slurry, spend more time characterizing the material and getting a good handle on what kind of material you have and predicting where it's going to go, and then designing your input so that it targets areas on the marsh where the hydrology, the natural hydrology of the marsh, will help move the material around.
And I'll just jump in and add that in part because of the difficulty with the array, the network of the of pipe layouts, and in part because of weather. We had really tough weather that winter, and also in part because we had expected much more fine grained material than we actually ended up with, because a big winter storm eroded a bunch of a dune, and so the sediment was much sandier than what the initial cores had suggested. You know, the site, we did end up placing some sediment in each one of the areas we had planned to, but not in very much of those sites. So I think we ended up with, you know, we have these big polygons, and I think we ended up placing sediment in about 20% of the area that we had originally planned. So.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Scott and Mattia have said. I think for Fortescue in particular, since it was like the first of this type of project that we had attempted, there was a lot of engineering discussions, a lot of meetings. We had a lot of plan meetings to review the engineering approach for that particular site, and a lot of, you know, just trial and error, because it was the first time of doing that type of application. And I think, you know, all in, everything worked out well in the end, but there was quite a bit of adaptive management and some anxiety from the science side on the machinery out at that site as well. With the Avalon site, we had approached that differently. We didn't have the same amount of equipment on the marsh, and we also didn't have the array of pipe networks for placement. That was handled more with material being angled and sort of sprayed out of the end of the nozzle out as far as that could reach, with less pipe really on the marsh plane itself. That had pluses and minuses also because of both wind and the weather that Mattia mentioned. You know, we had some issues controlling kind of where that spray went. And to Scott's point about understanding the hydrology, we had mapped some of those internal you know, pools and pans, and had some sense as to where water was going to be flowing when we designed the containment at Avalon. But then we had areas where, you know, even with a pyramid stack of containment, we used a lot of those core fabric logs as our barriers for holding material in place at Avalon. We were having leakage and breaches out of those containment spots in some of the lowest elevation points. And I think in hindsight, perhaps some of the placement cells could have been shrunk down in size, so it was a little more manageable because we had some pretty big polygons, to Mattia's point, to place material in, and that became a little bit more difficult to manage with the spray approach there, as opposed to more of the gridded engineered approach that was utilized at Fortescue.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing to that, and that is large deep areas are easier to fill than shallow small areas. So, and containment is just really hard to manage, but I think it's probably easier in the long run to design a dredging project to keep the water content down than it is to try to do it the other way and to manage the water on the marsh. I think the marsh, you need to say, this is how much the marsh can take, or this is how much this one area can take. Once you're there, you move on to the next area. You just have to have those multiple areas defined.
Yeah, this is Lenore. If I could add something about this, I think a big challenge for this is containment does exactly that. It contains, but it also contains the water you're trying to dewater. So the notion, it's expected that the lower areas were going to have some breaches, and that's where the material was going to outflow. So, one of the lessons I think we learned certainly from the Avalon side is to let the material go in some places. Understand it's going to need to go. Understand you're going to need to let it dewater, and that water has to go somewhere. And I would add on the other side of that is some of the containment, which we learned in the adaptive management side, that I think we'll talk about later, prevented some of the natural hydrology from reestablishing. And that served to prolong some of the negative conditions that were created on site by the placement. So it's a balancing act in containing to keep material where you want it, but allowing it to dewater and allowing some of the natural systems to respond again. And I think that's again, that was a lesson we learned there. And I think it's an important balancing act that you got to kind of think through as you're designing these projects.
Yeah, that's a great point, because again, the natural hydrology of the system has a huge implications on the geochemistry of the place sediment. And, that brings up a great point that I'll bring Rob into the discussion about, the importance of kind of understanding the quality of the sediment that you're about to place on the marsh and some of the implications that may have on some of the outcomes, especially for pH and veg recovery. So, Rob, I don't know if you want to take a moment to kind of talk about, from a soil scientist perspective, looking at these projects in hindsight, what are some of the things to kind of consider about sediment quality and some of the outcomes that could form from, again, the geochemistry?
Thanks, Bart. Yeah, geochemistry wise, these soils will produce acid sulfate conditions. You're exposing something or bringing something, soil materials, we call them soils instead of sediment, but soil material to the surface that has been permanently submerged for quite some time. So when you do atmospherically expose some of those materials, they do produce acid sulfate soil conditions, especially when you allow them to dry out and they are not kept in moist conditions. So geochemically, that becomes a little bit of a nightmare, producing acid sulfate soil conditions. So your pHs, what does that mean? That your pHs drop and plummet to sometimes around the 2, 3, or a pH of 4 value, which is very difficult for vegetation reestablishment. And that seems to be definitely one of the end goals or the successes of these types of projects. So just be aware that they do geochemically change the soils themselves, especially when they do get dry or dry out, and just beware and be looking out for yellow pools and clouds of material floating across your marsh. If you do see those yellow pools, that means that acid sulfate is being generated on your particular site.
So Rob, kind of a follow-up. So in the way of thinking about designing a project, if you know you're going to be dredging up fine grain, organic, rich silts and clays, placing them on the marsh. So from a design standpoint, it would probably be better for the designers to think about creating a low marsh with an active hydrology versus trying to stack it to create more of a high marsh that you're going to have less inundation and more likely to have that aerobic exposure and acid sulfate. So would that be a good way to kind of think about how what you're telling you could kind of utilize that into some of your design and what you may expect to see?
Absolutely. You're spot on, Bart. Spot on with that. I couldn't have said it better. Very well said.
I have a question about that though, because Rob, when we were out at Avalon, there was very little organic matter in the sediment that was being dredged in place there, very low carbon, very low organic matter. And some of those really high and dry areas that we found to be acidic were sand. So is it just areas that have organic matter, or can it be, and fine grain, or can it be these sandy areas also?
It's all of those materials. It's every little bit of, so the sands are a little bit better. They do cook or evolve or produce acid sulfate a little bit quicker. You know, naturally those silts do tend to take a little bit longer to dry out and dewater versus the sands. The liquefied sand materials do dewater much quicker, and if allowed to dry out, will produce those acid sulfate conditions much quicker than the silts will. So good point, Mattia, good point.
And I will say, from an example in the Narrow River, where they used quarried sand that was rich in iron, and they started seeing acid sulfate reduction because it was rich in that iron, that they'd never thought about that. Again, they thought, oh, sand, we don't have to worry about that. But that's a great point, Rob.
Bart, real quick, is it worth some comment on timing? Because I think that the notion that we all, I think, are interested in enhancing elevation of marsh platforms and looking through sea level rise, and then trying to balance the ecological uplift we get and the timing gain we get. And if we were to decide that our end game is to avoid acid sulfides no matter what, then we're really basically probably limiting dramatically the ability to use dredged materials to create marsh elevation. So I wonder if, thinking about how long these actually persist, and maybe Rob could speak to that a little bit, but I did some of the chemistry work out at Avalon following the production of these acid sulfides, and we actually found that after about 2 years, they kind of dissipated and they are no longer there. So do we, I personally think it's pretty important that we don't always just go low, and that there are going to be times when we're going to want to go a little bit higher and understand that we have that risk. And how do you balance that, I guess, is what I'm saying. So yeah, I think we need to go higher at some point in time. So how do we think about that? And maybe Rob could comment about some of the duration of these things and what the implications really are.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Lenore. Go ahead, Rob.
Lenore, you hit the duration nail right on the head, because basically they do take, many periodic cycles to evolve and cook. I just want to say, I mean cooking in where the pH does plummet and drop. And then your tidal cycles and storm events, when they do begin to hit the site, they do start to promote further cooking, drying, and also re-moistening, so that the acid sulfate soil materials will begin to dissipate on that particular site. So you do have a couple years to do that within. And then, gosh, your second question or second point there was, oh gosh, what was it?
It's just the notion that maybe we understand it's coming. It's okay if we know there's a duration to it.
The thicker materials, if you do go too thick, you are going to produce a lot of harmful, I think, acid sulfate materials that do need to be contained on site. So you want to think about containment. Your point before, it's like, we do want to let some of the material go, but at that point, if you did get too thick and you have massive pools of yellow jarosites, which is the pyrite or the iron that's been cooked to those low pHs, need to contain that jarosite on site and sort of think about a mitigation plan of how you're going to treat those acid sulfate soils and not allow them to enter the rest of the estuary or the ecosystem, which could, potentially do fish kills, aquaculture, clam kills, oysters, that sort of thing. So didn't explain that extremely well, but.
No, but I think you bring up some good points, Rob, and I'll also bring up a few things that's where I think finding the balance between what we're talking about, where there may be a need for containment, but also a lot of times there is a need to introduce a hydrology. So if we're actively inundating the site, that can also ameliorate some of the formation from the get-go. Or again, it's the idea if you're doing multiple lifts, multiple thin lifts, where you're going to be coming back and dredging the same area again in a couple of years, maybe you do thinner lifts to kind of maybe make this not as much of an issue. It's not as persistent. So I will caution people there's a lot of literature that has been done on acid soil formation from Poplar Island, and I would caution anyone from applying that same type of research to your site. They do crust formation, so they dry out 30 feet of mud, and it does exactly what Rob says. So again, that's a little bit of a different situation. So right before we were going to do some audience questions, but I just want to quickly touch on one thing before we get to that. And I know we already integrated one of the questions from the chat as well, which was perfect. But one of the things it's huge in these projects is the contractor, the dredging contractor. And so I wanted to have the panel kind of give their impressions of, how important is it to find the right dredging contractor for these types of projects, especially when it's kind of new, and how did you overcome some of those challenges associated with, bringing contractors on, and even some of the perspective of, in hindsight, what were maybe some things that you would include in some of the contract language to solve some of the issues that you may have in the future?
I guess that's not so soft a ball in my direction. Since Monica's not here.
That could have been to anyone.
I would say that we would want to have a contractor who is experienced doing these types of projects. That putting somebody on the project who has not tried to do a marsh or either thin layer or spray or marsh elevation, marsh restoration, shore stabilization type project before is going to have a hard time with this. This is not the same as pumping into a confined disposal facility. And so the amount of control and the amount of options that they have are very different, and it's best to have experience. That's not to say that most dredging contractors who have navigational dredging experience couldn't do it, but the amount of time you're going to spend working through the adaptive management process is going to be challenging. So I would encourage people. We are now have a process by which we select people who have a higher level experience to do these projects.
It's great to hear. That's a big issue. Is there any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask the panel right now? We have 15 minutes till we kind of switch gears. I still have additional questions if we don't have anything, but if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.
I do see one question from Scott Stuber asking if these soils are problematic for the ecosystem. I assume they mean the acid sulfate soils.
They are slightly, you do, but more just for on-site consideration. You do want to get that vegetation establishing or reestablishing as quick as possible, and keeping the soils moist. If you do dry them out and do ditch the system extensively and have a lot of water and a lot of atmospheric exposure, look for your pHs to drop very, very rapidly and very significantly, and it becomes sort of like a moonscape. It's very tough to reestablish vegetation at that point.
All right, and then I don't see any more audience questions, but I have a question about these soils as well. Is there, when we're doing dredging projects, we're usually doing sediment contaminants analysis beforehand. Is there anything that we should be looking for when we test the soil chemically that would tell us about the evolution of the soils?
Great question, Ashley.
Not necessarily. I don't think, most of the materials that are of high N value or soils that are easy to put material in your hand and squeeze that material out, those would be high N value soils. They would not have the weight bearing capacity and would be quite difficult to contain, like the silts and the clays, but the sands are not as difficult to contain and keep on sites. Once you do have the dewatering process, the soils will stay on sites. But to your question, testing the soils preliminarily, they're going to all produce acid sulfate conditions if you let them dry out extensively. So yeah, not much you can.
Yeah, predict, get data on to predict it. It sounds like it's inevitable.
It is, it really is.
All right, we have a question from Danielle McCullough. She's wondering what design elements are required for permitting applications. Is there topographic info or hydrology included? And what considerations are most important in laying out the designs?
So from a design perspective for these projects, we had to do detailed topographic surveys at both sites. We had some issues at Fortescue due to frozen ground during the time of survey, which resulted in some deviations on elevations on the marsh plain. So you definitely want to be very careful with the survey that you collect at the sites, but you will need a detailed topographic survey, detailed wetland information. You want to know the tidal range for the site. And then for design selection and kind of informing elevations for your targets, you're also going to want to look at what are called biobenchmarks. So looking at where vegetation has established at the site, and what elevations that various Spartina alterniflora or Spartina patens or the other marsh species establish becomes really important. So having some frame of reference for a healthy marsh target that you're focusing on. In terms of calculations for hydrology, that's a little bit more of a gray area. If you're going to do an edge treatment, more of a living shoreline type approach, there's obviously calculations needed for wind, wake, wave action for designing any kind of edge treatment or structure. But if you're focused on primarily the marsh plain itself, just having a general understanding of where the tide cycle flushing occurs is more relevant than any kind of detailed modeling. And to the point that Lenore and Rob had made about containment and that impacting, sort of the flushing and the ability for disruptions to hydrology to occur is really critical. That's something that we learned, through the progression of these projects to really have a close eye on the containment and an understanding of how that containment functions throughout the dewatering process.
Yeah,
I'll add one thing. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to add one thing to Mary's point was also what we wrestled with a lot was consolidation of this material and, different types of material based on grain size will consolidate faster than other areas. So setting your target elevations, like in most cases, higher than where they're going to end up after consolidation was something that you really need to factor into this.
Joel, do you have any perspective on this? You did a lot of the permitting.
Yeah, from the permitting perspective, you have to permit both the dredging project and the restoration project. So you have two different beasts to deal with. In our case, we also had the Army Corps of Engineers doing the work at Avalon and NJDOT doing the work at Fortescue. So the federal regulatory process was all about a little different at the two sites also. The big thing is to make sure that from a big picture, high altitude view is that material you're going to dredge, you have enough of it and it's suitable quality, both grain size and from the contaminants to put it on the marsh it'll get the job done that you want to have done. You don't want to have too little material, and you don't want to have too much material. Because the dredging projects, they have to have a site or a management option to handle all the material they want to dredge. And from the restoration side, ideally you want to have the exact amount you need to get to the target elevations to get to, but you don't want to have more, because then the dredging project kind of gets jammed up, that's what happened. Essentially happened to Fortescue when we found out that we had a lot more sandier material than originally planned. So we came up with the options for the beach nourishment project and to build the dune. From the state perspective, there's a general permit for the restoration projects. And the Corps of Engineers also has nationwide permits for restoration projects, but you still need the individual permits for the dredging projects. We could talk a lot more about permitting, but I think that's kind of the big high altitude view of it.
And I'll just add that when it comes to designing the containment, understanding the hydrology, for the projects that we've done since, that's where we've focused, is rather than minimizing the amount of containment that we want to put out there so that the water can get out, as Lenore mentioned. And also we're counting on the marsh grasses to hold the sediment back. So having enough of a buffer between whatever waterways are for whatever pathway the water is going to take to get off the site, and for the tide to get in and out on its tidal cycle needs to be well understood. And the containment should be focused on those areas that don't have any marsh grasses, like those channels. Also, with regard to upfront data, you don't only need the topographical information, you also need the hydrographic information for the pools. So just knowing that there's pools or channels, you also need to know how deep they are, especially if you're trying to fill them.
Well, and just to continue on what along this conversation, Danielle had brought it up too, there is a balancing act between, what's required in the dredger's reaction to that versus, the biological considerations. Did you guys have any, anything that come up like that where trying to balance between what the dredgers felt they could actually construct versus some of the biological outcomes that we're hoping for, or some of the requirements for the regulatory authorities?
Yeah, I'll just say with regard to engineering, there's definitely a placement minimum. So if you're looking to actually place material in a certain area at a certain depth, not counting on the natural flow of that material across the marsh and generating some sort of a very thin layer of silts and fine grained material going out at a very reduced slope from the placement site. That placement site at 6 inches is about the minimum that you can get, because you need a certain amount of you need to pump into a certain area for a certain amount of time in order to make it productive, and before you move on to the next area. If you're constantly having to move the pipelines, you won't be able to keep production up high enough to keep the project affordable. So there is a minimum there, and it's a relationship between the depth that you're trying to place and the area that you're placing into. So.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, in addition to what Scott said, there's like a minimum depth that makes sense. We also tried to have we were shooting for even layers, like not necessarily even thickness, but for the top to be mostly even, or maybe have a little hump for positive drainage. And that was not at all realistic, because even at Avalon, where we had fine grained material, there was some sand, and the sand fell out and stacked up. And so I think that was a major lesson learned for our team, was that you have to expect you're going to have changes, undulations in topography when you're done. It's not going to be a smooth surface.
If I could just add to that real quickly, there's two reasons for that. Aside from the hydrologic settle out that Mattia talked about, is the underlying surface has different levels of effective resistance, right? So the pool areas, they're going to just keep taking material and it's sinking in. Some of the platform had good stability, other parts of the platform didn't. So you've got all that differential subsidence that factors into this. That matters a lot at the end of the day. And then the other thing I just want to warn you is, once you start pumping, it's extremely difficult to access the pipe ends. So I think there's a lot more thought that, well, I'll just get out there and when it's time to move it and I can move it somewhere else. You can't do that. You're done. And I kind of wonder at some point in time when you're trying to figure out if this is all going to work, if it makes sense to pump water for, I don't know, a day, a half a day, and see where it goes. See if it goes actually where you thought it was going to go. See if your containment is where you think it should be. Because you can turn off the pipe that you were pumping water and you can go out to your site, you can access it again. Whereas after 2 days of pumping slurry of mud, you can't really do very much back on the site. I realize that may affect your, the financing and the costs of it, but I think in the couple of projects I've worked on, it would have been really nice to have known where it was going to go before I couldn't get to the pipe anymore.
Yeah, one problem with what Lenore just said is as you start pumping, conditions on the marsh change too as things start settling out. So sometimes, you think where the water's and the sediment's going to go, and it doesn't go that way because this starts building up on the marsh, especially the sand fraction will drop out first and mound up by the end of the pipe, and the silt spread out. I mean, and so that's why the adaptive management is really important. Like Scott said, minimize the containment, but be prepared to go out there and throw up some more containment if you need as things start changing on the marsh. One thing Scott had said earlier was about having experienced contractors doing the dredging work. I think that was another critical point that we learned, that not if they have experience, but they understand that what the end results of the project are. It's not just to dredge a channel and throw the material up on the marsh. It's to do it in a certain way so that we get a viable marsh at the end of the project. And it's not like the old style dredging project where you're just pumping into a CDF or whatnot. It's a little more complicated than that, and they have to be willing and ready to work with the biologists and the ecologists to actually get the restoration project done.
Yeah, I'll add to that's a great point about retracking through the material for some of these pumpings. And, there's projects that have been done in the past. Pepper Creek in 2013, we used a remote spray barge and pushed the barge along the shoreline and channels to counteract that. And I think we're seeing a lot of projects now who are moving towards using roadways, dikes, different things like that to move the pipes on. So that's a key point. Thanks for that discussion. Do we have any other questions we have a minute left. Do we have any other questions that are?
I just see one question from Patty. Scott, what about the size of the area that a 6-inch minimum would apply? I had the same question because
I answered that. It really depends on the material that you're pumping. I think that the guys when they get the data from the channel or the burrow area that's been selected, then they can better predict how large the area needs to be. It also depends on the depth, so if you're filling into a 10-foot deep pool like we did at Fortescue, you can pump on that for a long time before it becomes a problem. And obviously there's not a 6-inch minimum if you're trying to achieve 10 foot of depth. But if you're pumping onto marsh plain that exists but is unstable, that's where things get a little bit trickier. And it's going to depend a lot on the underlying materials as well as the material that you're pumping. So how stable is the marsh platform? Is it water underneath, or is it actually stable soil underneath? Is it silt? Is it clay? Is it organic? All that's going to depend. So I can't answer the question with there's no one relationship.
Set number. Yeah.
It's a model. It's a model. That's why I'm saying that I think a little bit more upfront work on the hydrology and the nature of the marsh platform is, as well as the, we understand the biology and understand the vegetation and the goals, but now we're starting to see that there's some engineering data that's really needed in order to minimize containment and to maximize the productivity.
Thank you. Well said, Scott. Yeah, I think the word that I always use is microtopography. We don't want the whole elevation to be the same elevation. You want variation. It's a good thing. And I think that's a good point to kind of transition from constructability. And we're going to be going to the second theme of today. We're going to be having Mattia to talk about the trade-offs between elevation gain, recovery time, and other biological and ecological considerations. They collected a whole host of data and so Mattia is going to talk about some of the data and what they've seen and kind of some of those trade-offs. And then after that presentation, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. And if there's nothing, we still have time left over, we can always come back to any outstanding issues that pop up from this first part. So Mattia, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Bart. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about elevation data, and then Liz Muntean from the Nature Conservancy is going to talk about vegetation, and then so she's going to present on that as well. There's Liz. Okay. Second. Okay. You guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so today we're going to be talking to you about the Avalon project that we've been talking about, the Fortescue project we've been discussing, as well as Ring Island. And we'll be focusing on elevation and vegetation. I want to upfront acknowledge all of the people who worked for us to be able to get to this point. We had multiple groups collecting elevation data and vegetation data, multiple groups analyzing that data. And so this has really been a very large group effort that has led us to be able to present this information today. As a reminder, we're talking about these three projects. Avalon, they're all in South Jersey. Avalon is here, Ring Island project is here, and then we have Fortescue over here. The projects were constructed between the summer of 2014 and very early 2016. We had three project success criteria, so three things we were looking to see from as a result of doing the projects. We'll be focusing on talking about the first two today. The first is to increase and maintain an optimal tidal elevation for native salt marsh species. The second is to increase the cover and health of native salt marsh vegetation. Primarily here we were targeting high marsh species, and to return all other metrics to baseline conditions unless they were expected to change due to habitat conversion. So, and we won't be talking about this today, but that was looking at species utilization, soil chemistry, water chemistry, things like that. So again, we'll be focusing on target elevations and vegetation today. So the questions that Liz and I are going to hope to answer today are, did we achieve our target elevation / target thickness? How much elevation was gained and then sustained? How did plants respond to placement? Did meeting our target elevations lead to an increase in the cover and health of native salt marsh plants? Were high marsh plant communities established, and why or why not? So first I'll be looking at, did we achieve our target elevation / thicknesses? So the methods here is that placement areas were delineated in the field by walking the extent of the area that received sediment with the GPS to map placement area polygons. Then digital elevation models were created from the RTK GPS points or the LiDAR points, depending on how the data was collected. And then these digital elevation models were clipped to just the placement areas. Next, we used Raster Calculator to look at changes in elevation over time. So we would subtract one DEM from another DEM to look for changes in elevation. And then for sites where we were targeting specific elevations, we used the reclassify tool to determine the number of pixels that were above, within, or below target ranges. I do need to note some caveats with this, which is that small changes in elevation are ecologically significant at these sites. We use the best available methods for determining elevation, but there's still some large error that's associated with the data collection and interpolation. And so I'll be discussing these, all of the numbers I discuss need to be considered estimates. The other thing that you need to know is I'll be talking about two different types of targets. So we have our target dredge material placement elevation, this is the elevation at which we stopped pumping sediment. So we said, okay, once it gets to this point, we're going to stop pumping. And that was with the expectation that some of that initial elevation would be lost as the water came out of the sediment, as the material consolidated, as it moved around, and that eventually it would decrease in elevation until it reached our target ecological elevations. So the second set of targets are based on what we thought would be the ideal elevation for the high marsh habitat that we were targeting. So for each site, I'll show two separate maps. The one on the left is looking at that initial as-built condition. So very soon after the sediment was placed, surveys were done, and that is looking at that target placement elevation. Did we reach that target placement elevation? And then the map on the right will be looking at whether or not we achieved our target ecological elevations as it was mapped in 2019. Each one of the maps that I'll be showing has a within range. Sometimes we had a range that we were targeting, sometimes it was a specific elevation, but either way, I created a range that was about 1/2 of a foot. So this first site is Ring Island, where we were placing sand. And here we were targeting a 3 or 6 inch elevation increase. And this target was developed based on what we had read would be what plants would either grow back through or recover quickly from. So here we have the change in elevation between the baseline and as-built on the left. About 60% of the site was within that, slightly less than 3 inches to slightly more than 6 inches. And the rest of the site was primarily above that increase. And we had very similar results again in 2019, so not very much elevation was lost. At Avalon, we have these different polygon blobs that we were talking about before, where we contained kind of around each one of these areas. And they had different target elevations. And so this is a consolidation of that. And so we have a range here. And in 2016, for the as-built survey, we had about 50% that was within that target elevation. Those are those areas in green, about 30% above target elevations, and about 30% of the site below target elevations. The reason why this area here, area E, had so much above target elevations was likely because this site had the lowest target elevations that were set. So it's not necessarily that this area is higher than in the other sites. It's probably more that just the target was set lower. And then we had, it was pretty similar again in Avalon in 2019. So there was elevation that was lost. At Ring Island, we had these same 3 to 6 inch targets for 2014 as we had for 2019. But at Avalon, we have our initial placement elevations in 2016, and then we expected it to lose elevation to 2019. And we had about 50% of the site that was within those target ecological elevations in 2019, and then about 30% that was above and about 20% that was below. Fortescue, we have kind of the opposite situation. So again, we had a target range here. In 2016, for the as-built, we had about 55% of the site that was within the target elevation range, and the majority of the rest of the site was below. By 2019, we had lost some of that initial elevation increase, and we were now down at about 40% of the site being within, and then the majority of the rest of the site was below, with some other areas that were also above. So how much elevation was gained and sustained? So for this, instead of using the interpolated maps and the DEMs, we're using the raw RTK data. The data was clipped to placement areas again, so we're just looking at areas that receive sediment. And then a done Kruskal-Wallis multiple comparisons test was done to look to see whether or not there were significant changes in elevation over time. And I'll be also showing graphs of the quartiles. So at Ring Island, there was an initial gain of about of a median of 1/2 a foot, and that was generally maintained over time. At Avalon, unfortunately, our 2016 data was collected with LiDAR, and I didn't have the raw LiDAR data. So here we're just looking at the change, the median change in elevation between 2015 and 2019. And there is a 0.33 of a foot gain. And then at Fortescue, we had initially a gain of 0.4 feet, and then that decreased between 2016 and 2019 to 0.2 feet. So what's an interesting way to look at this, especially in thinking about some of the discussions that we had earlier about the trade-offs and how long, as Liz will be talking about, how long it takes for sites to revegetate, and how frequently we want to place sediment, on these marshes again. It's interesting to think about the number of years that these elevation gains theoretically buy you in terms of sea level rise. And so here we're looking at a sea level rise is currently at about 6 millimeters per year. And we can translate our inches and feet of elevation gain into millimeters. And what this suggests is that at Ring Island, where we gained the most elevation, we maybe gained about 25 years of worth of sea level rise. This is not counting any natural elevation increases, which marshes tend to have. So this is just as a result of what was placed. And it's kind of more of a, we should treat these less as like actual numbers and more as just a sort of hypothetical to think about, because there's a lot of factors at play here. At Avalon, it was about 17 years, and Fortescue, about 11 years. So in terms of the discussion on this section, most of the sites had about, all of the sites had about 50% that was within the target, the target placement elevations, and then also within the target ecological elevations. But there was a lot of variation in elevation across the sites. Ring Island gained the most elevation at 1/2 foot. Avalon gained the middle amount with 0.3 feet, and Fortescue gained the smallest amount of elevation at 0.2 feet. Again, however, it's very difficult to measure small changes in elevation. And I think that is one of there are lots of lessons learned from doing this, but one of them is just, if we're thinking about having 6 inches be the minimum amount that we're placing on the marsh, even at 6 inches, it's pretty hard to measure a 6-inch difference on a squishy marsh with very variable conditions. Okay, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you, and let me know when you want me to change the slides.
Okay, sounds good. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So in terms of vegetation, these are the main questions that we were asking. The first being, how did the plants respond to placement? The second being, did we meet our target elevations, and did it lead to an increase in the cover and health of native salt marsh plants? And were those high marsh plant communities established? Next, please.
Ooh. Hold on, I'm having technical difficulties. There we go.
Okay, so as you can see in the drone imagery, the visual impact of placement was pretty dramatic from before placement at the baseline in 2013 for Ring Island to 2016. The second growing season, you still see that large impact of the sediment on the marsh that's blocking vegetation cover. But then by 2020, you start to see some of that vegetation cover coming back. And then one of the caveats with our Ring Island analysis in terms of vegetation cover is that a lot of our plots were placed in the highest elevation areas, so where we placed the deepest sediment. So we are missing a little bit of that. We're not quite capturing all of the vegetation recovery that is happening in Ring Island due to that sort of skew towards conservative covering of our site. Next, please. All right, and then here we have Avalon. This is a close-up of Area F, where we have the pre-placement conditions, where you can see there are some pools in that area that are then filled in with the placement material in 2016, and by 2020 we do see some pools returning, but also some recovery of vegetation as well. Next, please. And then Fortescue is the most visually dramatic as pre-placement. It's a bit patchy, not super green and vegetated as you see it coming back after placement in 2020, 2015. It's highly vegetated. Next, please. So the methods that we used for estimating vegetation cover for our monitoring protocol was we used permanent meter squared plots on the marsh that we visited every year during peak growing season. And the canopy cover was visually estimated using the Braun Blanket classification scheme. And then I have analyzed them using Wilcox, Zimmerman, Whitney U-test to compare placement and control sites, and then Friedman tests with the menu post hocs for comparing over time. And unfortunately, I was not able to compare control and placement directly over time because it's very non-parametric data. And then for the mixed models, which we ran to try and understand the different factors influencing vegetation cover, we used the elevation data, the RTK GPS data. Distance to water and veg were measured in ArcMap using the drone images. Soil placement depth was measured with a ruler in the center of our vegetation plots in the first year after sediment placement. And soil penetration depths were quantified using the standard force that was applied with a slide hammer attached to a PVC. And it measured the depth of penetration in centimeters. And we ran all of those metrics in a robust regression model. Some of them were linear depending on the normality of the data. Next, please. So in Ring Island, well, first, let me just explain the layout of this graph. So the green line for all of the following graphs is our control plots, and the brown line is our treatment plots. And any significance is noted with an asterisk, and that's years where the vegetation cover was significantly different from baseline conditions. So in Ring Island, the sample size was very small, and we see that the vegetation cover dramatically decreased in the year after placement, but then due to the family-wise error rate, this analysis might need a little bit more work, but it is still below baseline conditions. And additionally, the control plots have declined significantly from their baseline conditions. Next, please. And then here in Avalon, we see that in the treatment plots, the vegetation cover decreased dramatically from baseline conditions and stayed that way through the first year and second year after placement, and that has returned to a level that is not significantly different from baseline conditions. But again, we see in this final year, there's been a slow decline in the control plot vegetation cover. Next, please. And then here for Fortescue, we see a very similar pattern as Avalon, where there was a dramatic decrease in the first year after placement, stayed low through the second year, and then has increased to non-significantly different levels, although this past year there has been a dip lower, and then also a dip in the control plots. And I saw that question in the chat about why the control plot vegetation cover might be decreasing. Having been out on the marsh collecting the data this summer, there seems to be a lot of drowning happening. The marshes just seem to be deteriorating still in a lot of places, and I think potentially without the sediment enhancement, these control areas are starting to see some decline in health. But that is, yeah, not a happy thing, but I also could be wrong. So next, please. So to sum it up, vegetation cover is declined initially after sediment placement, but 6 years after recovery has recovered to a non-significantly different level from baseline and control conditions at Avalon and Fortescue, but Ring Island, that significance is limited due to the placement of our plots and also our small sample size. Next, please. So here we have the results of our mixed models that we ran to try and understand the factors that were influencing the trends in vegetation recovery. And this is the results from our 2021 analysis. So for Ring Island and Avalon, in the past, we ran these same models and there had previously been no significant metrics correlated with veg recovery, but now in this final year, for Ring Island, the sediment placement depths are still significant. So higher, deeper placement depth means lower vegetation cover still at Ring Island. That trend has disappeared for Avalon and Fortescue. And for the stem heights at Ring Island, they are seeing that there are taller stems at lower elevations and closer to the water and closer to already existing vegetation. And then for Avalon, we ended up splitting the data up into plots that started as pools and plots that started as platforms, since they have very different characteristics and the way that we were treating them had very different goals. So for plots that started as platforms, the vegetation cover decreased further from existing vegetation and from tidal water bodies, but it increased with sediment placement depths. So areas that received more sediment were more vegetated in this final year. And additionally, as the penetration depths increased, so as the soil was soupier, there was less vegetation cover. So firmer, higher soils were higher vegetation cover in Avalon platform plots. And for the pool plots, the vegetation cover was negatively correlated with vegetation, so that plots closer to vegetation recovered more quickly. And we think this is due to the rhizome propagation of many of marsh plant species, so sort of conveys an advantage if there's more edge with placement, and it allows those rhizomes to re-enter into the placement areas and initiate that revegetation more quickly. And for Fortescue, no correlation with veg cover anymore. It's recovered to the point where we think that those correlations are no longer explaining any variation that we're seeing in veg cover at Fortescue. And we do see for the stem heights at Fortescue, the stem heights are taller and soupier soils and at lower elevations, which is what we expect, especially since tall forms, Spartina alterniflora is usually seen along creeks and pools. So where the soils are soupier and elevations are lower. So that's happening as expected. And then in terms of species composition, our project questions were very concerned with the presence and health of high marsh species specifically, which ideally meant facilitating Spartina patents. But in our monitored plots, Spartina alterniflora remained the dominant species throughout the monitoring period. After placement, the plots were colonized by Salicornia and Disticulus plicata, but in Avalon and Ring Island specifically, we did not facilitate any Spartina patents. There is still patents at Fortescue, but it hasn't returned to the same level of dominance as it was in baseline conditions for the treatment plots. Next, please. And then one last thing was I took a look at how the sediment placement depths corresponded to vegetation cover over time. And that metric was significant for all plots combined. So for the first year, second year, fourth year, after placement, that was a significant correlation. So deeper placement depths meant lower veg cover, but then by post-placement year 6, that correlation was no longer significant, and some of those deeper plots with deeper placement had started to revegetate, as you can see, sort of that scatter plot sort of spreading out and becoming more even across the x-axis there. Okay, next, please. Okay, that's it for me. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. One of the other things that, one of the other ways to take a look at this, one of the other questions that we had was, okay, so if we were generally kind of within our target elevations, did we pick the right target elevations? And how did vegetation respond to elevation placement spatially? So in order to do that, one of the things that we've looked at so far is to map the sites based on the tidal datums. And so in theory, like based on a theoretical model of a salt marsh, you'd have low marsh plants showing up between mean water and mean high water, and you'd have high marsh from mean high water to mean higher high water. So we'll take a look at maps of each of the sites, kind of taking a look at that. At Ring Island, the only area that's below mean higher high water is these kind of purpley pink areas. Everything else is above mean higher high water. So rather than just mapping the tidal datums, I mapped things that were above mean higher high water. And what's interesting here is that I also overlaid the areas that were determined to be vegetated or unvegetated based on some drone photo work that was done at DEP. The areas with these slashes through it, the black slashes through it, are unvegetated. And then the other areas with no markings in it are considered to be vegetated. And what you can see is that it is these higher elevations, this like chartreuse and red area, that tend to remain unvegetated. So there does seem to be some relationship here, again, with the thickness of placement or the final, the height of the elevation and vegetation recovery time. Okay. Here we're looking at tidal datums at Avalon. Areas that were within the low marsh area are in blue. Areas that we thought would be targeting high marsh are within green, and then areas above mean higher high water are in red here. So you can see that 68% of the site as of 2019 data collection was above that mean higher high water line. So should be a lot of elevation capital there. And then at Fortescue, looking at the same map, we had about 53% of the site that was in that high marsh range, the mean high water to mean higher high water, and then a significant portion of the site that's also above mean higher high water. So hopefully that also equates to some elevation capital at the sites. But what's confusing is that we didn't end up with Spartina patents, despite having kind of this, what theoretically should be based on biobenchmarks, based on tidal datums, should be this really nice space for Spartina patents to grow. Instead, as Liz mentioned, we ended up with Spartina alterniflora still being the dominant species. So in wrapping up, there are some considerations. So the take-home messages that we have pulled out of this are that higher elevations, especially when above mean higher high water, the slower the vegetation recovers, but that doesn't mean that the vegetation doesn't recover, it's just recovering more slowly. Fortescue, which gained the least amount of elevation, vegetated the fastest. Ring Island, which gained the most elevation, has been revegetating the slowest. And then Avalon is in the middle, middle elevation gain, kind of middle amounts of revegetation. As Liz mentioned, we have found that there's declining vegetation cover in the control sites at all 3 of the sites. So that's something that we want to look into. In addition to having the higher the elevation, the slower the vegetation recovery, Liz found that the thicker the placement, the slower the vegetation recovery. Up to a certain point, after a certain number of years, that relationship disappeared. We want to be mindful of the loss of ecosystem function and services while the marsh recovers from placement. And we need to kind of balance that with the need to gain enough elevation relative to sea level rise. So I think there are some really interesting conversations we could have about that, about you know, how many years does it take for specific ecosystem services and functions to recover based on the elevation gain, and how many years is that elevation gain buying you? And where do we want to kind of theoretically set those trade-off limits? After 6 to 7 years, our sites have not surpassed the baseline vegetation cover. That was one of the goals for these projects, although some of them have returned to baseline condition. And the dominant species, Spartina alterniflora, despite targeting and achieving our high marsh elevations, we still have Spartina alterniflora as the dominant species. And then one thing I didn't add up here is that I was pretty impressed after running all of this data that given that these were the first projects like this that any of us who were working on them had done, that we were able to get 50% of the sites within our target placement elevations. And then that those generally ended up being within our target ecological elevation. So being able to predict how much dewatering was going to happen, I felt pretty good about that. And then just a couple of monitoring considerations. One, again, it's really difficult to measure and map small changes in elevation. But considering that there are these trade-offs between elevation gain and functional recovery of these sites, it would be really great to be able to more accurately measure these small elevation changes in the marsh. And then, as Liz had mentioned, we had randomly selected our permanent vegetation monitoring plots, and it didn't really capture this edge effect, which Liz found, where you were more likely to have vegetation recover the closer it was to existing vegetation, or the closer it was to creeks or pools. And so the permanent monitoring plots ended up being more centrally located and didn't capture that kind of edge effect. So we're probably underrepresenting the actual plant cover and recovery. And with that, I think Liz and I can take questions, or you guys can move on to whatever you would like.
Thanks so much. That was great. So everyone, if you have questions, raise your hand or put them in the chat.
We do have one question in the chat from Danielle. I'm going to paraphrase here, but she's wondering if existing Spartina alterniflora root mass makes it spread and dominate at higher elevations before the patents can come in. So what would happen if you put a clump of patents within those higher elevations to help it gain ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, and I think there's also a seed bank question there, because Spartina alterniflora was the dominant species in the baseline conditions also. And we did plant Spartina patents in the marshes, but they didn't survive. And it could be because of the acid sulfate soils or other wacky chemistry, that first year. And yes, probably the rhizomes are, a lot of the alterniflora is from the rhizomes. And I know that there have been studies that found that alterniflora would outcompete patents at first, but then at those higher elevations, patents would be likely to come in. So yeah, but love to hear other people's thoughts about that. Liz or Adriana or Mary, anybody else?
Anyone else have any comments on that?
All right, hearing no comments, I do see that Bill has his hand raised. Bill, if you want to come off mute to ask your question.
Sure. Hey, Mattia, in your earliest slides in this last set, you looked at you had the sites and the elevation. Look to me, am I right that the sites gained elevation after construction in the years following construction?
That's probably error.
Okay.
You know, I think it might be likely that it could happen in a site like Fortescue where you have enough vegetation to be really trapping sediment, but it's not likely at Ring Island, so that's probably error.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I just was wondering about that.
Any more questions?
Yeah, just to comment on the elevations, when Mattia and I were going over them, I mean, it's critical you want to get these elevations right, but given the methods and the inherent error in the methods, and then you add placement error on top of that, it's really difficult. So, we talked earlier about having, 6 inches minimum placement depth to have potentially viable projects. I've seen some projects where we're trying to place just a cut 2 or 3 inches, and I just don't see that actually working out. It's just really difficult to get these elevations right, and people just need to recognize that when they're doing these type of projects.
Great point. I think as we're waiting for more questions, one thing I'll throw out to Elizabeth and Mattia, and then anyone else really, if they want to input it as well, is, based upon your findings, when we think about adaptive management for vegetative response, kind of looking at your data, knowing that, you had a 6 to 7 year kind of response where it's starting to, it's getting closer, we're getting to that point, but regulatory authorities may not give you 6 years. Sometimes they're looking for 3 to 5 years. What are some good ways to think about trigger points for how you think about your revegetation of the site? Again, sediment type, thickness, all impact, veg type, seed source. What are some kind of things that you would throw out to people to think about adaptive management for veg recovery, of what you should be looking for, ways to think about it?
Liz, do you have thoughts? Or Joel, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, just, from a regulatory perspective, a lot of times you're looking at 85% recovery for sometimes in the permits. What happened here, though, it looks like, is that the controls decreased at the same time. You're getting some increases at the actual project sites. So that's something that has to be considered, I think, when you're looking at what does project success really mean, and really why are the controls, if they, over this 5-year interval or so, if the control sites are decreasing, what's causing that? Will you ever get back to that baseline level? And whether that's just because it's these sites, there's a bunch of other regional kind of monitoring projects going on. I'm vaguely familiar with, but I don't know if they're seeing any similar kind of trends where numbers are going down at their sites. Be interesting to see how that compares to what we have for our control data.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to compare that to the New Jersey Tidal Wetlands Monitoring Network data around surface elevation tables. Yeah, I think just like Bart, a couple of the things we talked about before, potentially waiting to plant until the soils are a little bit more baked, as Rob said, and established. If you have that luxury, often these projects are funded by grants that are on a really short timeline, and it can be hard to find the funding to do another topographic survey and then buy plants and do the big effort for planting it, 3 years out or something. And I think, and to that, I know there's some disagreement about how many years these projects need, how many years should we be paying attention to these projects among our project team. And I think there's some good reasons for that discussion and those potential disagreements. But I think, from my perspective, these are not 3-year projects. They're 8 or 10-year projects. And that doesn't mean you have to be going out and doing intensive things every year, but that at least until we really have a better idea of what the trajectory is, that, these are 10 or 15-year projects, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree with Mattia, but it's just kind of inherently needs to be a long-term sort of deal, especially looking at those multi-metric mixed models that I had ran for every year. It was just different variables came in as the most significant factors that were influencing vegetation recovery. And it's just such a dynamic system that I think it's still hard to predict what exactly is the most important thing to look at to predict successful vegetation recovery.
Well, thanks. That was great. Kind of another thing that kind of comes out of this paramount to what you guys were talking about was elevation monitoring. And you kind of touched on a little bit some of the issues associated with that. But, you know, we take for granted how we collect that data. So what's some of your kind of looking back at maybe your monitoring plan of how you collected your elevation data, and maybe moving forward, some of the ways that maybe you're thinking about looking at elevation data and also maybe veg cover, collecting it maybe different ways. I know you talked about LiDAR and there's a lot of issues with that. Maybe if you want to go into a little bit of discussion about methods and maybe how maybe you would think about some of them differently, or you would think about them the same way.
Yeah, in terms of the elevation data, I think I thought we did a good job of having fairly regular intervals where we were looking at the data. So the baseline was really important for both vegetation and elevation topographic surveys. The as-built survey was really informative. So that was the survey we did right after the sediment was placed. And then we kind of did it every 2 years. And I think that worked out pretty well. When we were doing RTK surveys, we did the same transects with the same intervals as closely as possible, which I think was beneficial. While the LiDAR was really interesting, it was ground-based LiDAR, and I think it worked well in terms of getting a good surface in areas that had no water and were unvegetated, which we had a fair amount of that first year. It was more difficult to work with, and I think next time I would just stick with one consistent method, which would be RTK surveys, because as your vegetation grows in, the LiDAR doesn't work. You can't tell where the base elevation is. So yeah, I would stick with like every 2 year time frame for the RTK surveys. Stick with transects, but actually maybe move more towards a grid. We had a transect, so we had our transects were. I forget, like the spacing wasn't exactly even. So our transects were even, but then the spacing from point to point along the transects was not the same as the spacing between the transects. So an actual grid survey would make the interpolation more accurate, I think. But yeah, and then I'll let Liz talk about the vegetation monitoring, but I did want to say that I would love if anybody else has ideas about how to get better results with the elevation monitoring, I would love to hear it. But Liz, do you want to talk about vegetation?
Sure. Yeah, I think for monitoring vegetation cover, we experienced a little bit of potential observer bias with the vegetation cover classes, and I think I'm not sure if doing that visual assessment of cover class is the most informative metric for estimating the health of the marsh. I wonder if there is maybe an alternative. Maybe someone has an idea of like an equally rapid and not like super resource intensive way of measuring vegetation. Because we had some instances where the cover classes that were assigned were not quite accurately depicting the trajectory of that particular plot. So that was definitely one of the bigger issues with monitoring.
Yeah, does anyone else have any input on that idea of different ways they've looked at it? I guess as we wait, see if anyone else wants to pipe in on that. Did you guys see any vegetation shifts, the temporal shifts? I think that's something that's I like to have people be aware of, that with some of these sites, you get these blooms of salicornia, different things like that are short-lived. How much did you guys experience that, and kind of what were some of your views of some of those trends?
That was something that I also tried to quantify as well, but we didn't have enough data to really see if vegetation senescence was part of the trends that we were seeing. But coming into September, it was like we did start seeing that all the Salicornia was turning red, and there was definitely more vegetation dieback starting to occur. So I think it would be very important to try and hit that peak growing season when monitoring, or at least have some way of reducing that error.
Art, were you also getting at the year-to-year kind of succession pattern where you get your big disturbance, early colonizer? So Liz has only had the benefit of being out there for a single year. So we have tracked this in our veg monitoring report. So being out there for 7 years, as I have with Mattia, we noticed same kind of pattern, right? Early colonizers of Salicornia, and then slowly Spartina alterniflora and Disticulus kind of moving in. It's been challenging to quantify. It's more on the anecdotal, what was in this plot last year, and then once it's alterniflora, it tends to be alterniflora. But I think there were some early years of concern when we had tons of Salicornia and then tons of dead Salicornia the next year. But the alterniflora came in, and nerves were calmed. So
yeah, that high amount of salt on your site, and you get that flush of it, and then it transitions out. I will say too that everyone, if you're not looking at the chat, there was some good input by Lori and Rob talking about some of the findings of Poplar Island. When they introduced tides, they had similar findings of, once they introduced tides to some of these units, they had similar trends in a year or two, and then things were kind of more back to normal. So don't forget to kind of look in the trends. There's been some good discussion there as well. Do we have any other comments from anybody? Go ahead and raise your hand if there's anything. Well, everyone was just so informative and just succinct. This was great.
I can start my wrap up and then if others, last minute questions pop into mind or things like that. So I really appreciate all of our panelists and our moderator, Bart, for kind of guiding us through. I think if you haven't checked out the lessons learned document and its sheer breadth, there shouldn't be any question in your mind that a ton of information was gained through the experience of doing these projects. And we've tried to transmit some of that information in varying levels of detail to you today. So the follow-up to this, and that is an effort for the Learning Network. So we're trying to early at the launch, we asked and folks had said, knowing project specifics would be really helpful. So this is our first crack at that nut. So to try to bring some experts